progress. Despite the many and varied challenges of the last couple of years, there's rarely a day goes by at the moment without the climate emergency featuring in the global headlines. With the dust now starting to settle after the 26th UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow back in November, the scale of the challenge and what it means to us as a transport industry is coming sharply into focus. We are in a privileged position. Wherever you're joining us from today around the world, we are not merely bystanders. Rather, we are the policymakers, the planners and the engineers that must come up with the solution. This is our industry's pandemic and our time to show that we are up to that challenge. Given this common endeavour, we wanted to share with you some of the insight and thinking we've developed as part of our own net zero journey, supporting local and national government make the right decisions to realise a net zero future. We're going to present for around about 20 minutes and we'll be turning our cameras off shortly to avoid distracting you. We'll then turn our cameras back on and open the floor to any questions that you may have. So if you pop these in the chat box as we go through, we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can within our 30-minute slot. My name is Simon Pope and I'm joined today by my colleague Tom Gold. Some of you may have attended the webinar Tom and I jointly gave a year ago on WSP's Carbon Zero Appraisal Framework, the proportionate way we have developed to quantify the carbon impact of transport infrastructure throughout the project lifecycle. You may also have seen on our website the playbook of solutions we've developed in order to help contribute towards transport net zero goals. A copy is also available to download in the handouts section on this GoToWebinar platform. Don't worry if you're not aware of either. Hopefully today's webinar will still resonate with you in whichever international jurisdiction you're working within, as we explore how in applying these approaches, we have uncovered some of the challenges and pitfalls to be aware of, and critically, the residual gaps in policy and strategy that still need to be filled urgently if we're to have a credible plan. In terms of an agenda, I'm going to reflect on the journey thus far, both in terms of our own capability, but also in terms of the changing policy landscape, reflecting on how the industry as a whole has had to adapt to keep pace with the political agenda. Tom will then reflect on what is necessary to deliver net zero transport at a scheme level, exploring the evidence and understanding of trade-offs needed in order to make appropriate investment decisions. I will then conclude on what this means for the bigger picture, how our expectations and demand for travel will need to change, and the policy decisions to enable these outcomes that are already rapidly approaching. But starting with the journey so far, and the ambition to put climate change at the centre of decision making when developing transport projects, programmes and policies. Our Carbon Zero Appraisal Framework was specifically developed in order to meet these needs. Critically, it's designed to be applied right from the earliest stages in the project lifecycle, when greatest opportunity to influence carbon and resilience outcomes exists, but data and understanding is often most limited. What we've badged as Carbon Zero is in practice a compilation of tools, data sets and methodologies for the appraisal of whole life carbon and the resilience of infrastructure to changing climate conditions. PAS 2080, the global standard for the development of low carbon infrastructure, lists a long list of factors that influence the carbon impact of a scheme, but we've simplified these down into 3 impact categories, these being user emissions, so the mix and characteristics of different modes using that infrastructure, whether drivers, cyclists, pedestrians or public transport users. Embodied carbon, involving construction, maintenance and end-of-life disposal. And additional impacts and opportunities, things that aren't inherent parts of a transport scheme, like changes to tree cover or energy generation. Our approach uses readily available input data, typically generated as part of the usual scheme development process, to feed a series of automated tools and processes that evaluate likely carbon impacts. Where data is not currently available, benchmarking to comparable appraisals enables an indicative quantification to be estimated, or alternatively, qualitative assessment can be produced. These appraisal tasks are then reported in a project-level appraisal summary, providing clear, concise and visual communication of impacts that can be increased in detail and robustness over time as the design matures. Scheme-level appraisals can also be collated and analysed at a programme level using our digital platforms to understand aggregated effects. The findings can then be used to challenge designs and decision-making, supporting decisions from the earliest stages on the type of infrastructure to deliver and how best to design it. In the 12 months since we originally presented on Carbon Zero, we have invested further in the development and used it extensively to appraise and influence decisions around whole life carbon at a scheme level. We've applied the approach to evaluate the effectiveness of transport programs and portfolios in meeting the carbon reduction challenge, signposting where changes in approach may be necessary to overcome undesirable effects or risks to delivery. Taking this a stage further, we've seen how the findings may be used to prioritise investment decisions and shape future scheme pipeline development to ensure alignment with emerging strategy. And perhaps most importantly of all, we've seen the need to bring net zero understanding and application into the mainstream, upskilling our industry to meet this new challenge by first understanding the right questions to ask, and then thinking about the appropriate evidence and solutions needed to respond to them. The changes we've seen in the work that we are being asked to do reflect the growing political momentum around the climate agenda and the resulting policy landscape. Many local authorities have now declared climate emergencies, mirroring declarations by devolved administrations and national governments. We're now seeing the repercussions of those declarations currently being wrestled with in terms of what they mean for policy and decision making, particularly amongst those authorities that have declared an ambition to achieve net zero in advance of national targets. In 2020, the UK government announced a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Other new commitments have been introduced at both state level in Australia and at national level in Canada. Perhaps most radically, the Welsh Government has paused all road building projects whilst it conducts a review into their associated impacts. And whilst COP26 at the end of last year was generally judged as being a necessary stepping stone to this year's conference, rather than the great leap forward that some had hoped, we are regardless starting to see tangible policy measures that recognise the need to limit emissions to within budgets defined by science-based targets. There is growing recognition that these decisions, however challenging, are now long overdue.
Thanks, Simon. And we thought it was worth a brief reminder of the scale and urgency of that challenge that we're talking about today. The substantive issue is that we can only emit a finite amount of greenhouse gases or carbon emissions if we're to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees and avoid the worst of climate change. There has historically been a disconnect between this fact and day-to-day decision making, but under the framework of the UN Paris Agreement, countries now have nationally determined contributions, limits on a nation's contribution to climate change. In the UK, these limits have been translated into law as carbon budgets in the form of progressively lower 5-year budgets that would have us on a trajectory to contributing fairly to keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5, and taking us to net zero by 2050. These budgets are hugely ambitious, requiring a 78% cut in emissions by 2035, but they provide meaningful targets that our day-to-day decisions can influence and therefore must consider. And transport decarbonisation is of course central to achieving these carbon budgets. It's the largest source of emissions in the UK, but unlike some other sectors, has made little progress in the last 30 years. However, we're now seeing a technology change towards zero-emission vehicles, and this will take us in the right direction. Business as usual levels of electrification, as forecasting current government data, is too slow, however, leaving us on a path to miss carbon budgets and net zero and have us contribute to the worst of climate change. The introduced bans on the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles will, however, accelerate progress and can be expected to significantly close the gap to net zero transport by 2050. But it leaves another 8 years in which new petrol and diesel cars will be sold, and old vehicles will remain in use well beyond 2030. Market forecasts suggest over half of the cars on our roads in 2035 will still be powered by fossil fuels. And this will mean our transport emissions will not fall at the pace that we need for carbon budgets. At a strategic level, this therefore means we need to be thinking about more ambitious actions, such as reducing car use, but at a project level, recognising the scale of the challenge and doing all we can to reduce emissions in infrastructure delivery. So through the development and application of our Carbon Zero appraisal framework, we've tried to achieve this, to provide a different way of developing schemes that places decarbonisation at the centre of decision making. And this approach has had to recognise that transport's contribution is a whole life impact. It's the balance of impacts such as user emissions and embodied that results in the net change in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We must therefore understand these impacts and shape schemes so they maximise carbon savings achieved by impacts such as mode shift and minimise those from impacts such as embodied carbon in construction. And these impacts are a product of decisions from the earliest stages of the project lifecycle, from the type of scheme selected at the strategy and policy level through to how the solution is designed and later constructed. The earlier that carbon impacts are understood, the greater potential there is to improve carbon outcomes, despite assessments being their least accurate at these early stages. But these principles and our learning applying them are best illustrated with example schemes, so I'll now move on to 2 examples of different transport schemes. So firstly, if we take a new major road scheme, for example, a new bypass, on user emissions, this may realise some carbon savings from traffic efficiencies, such as reduced journey lengths or stop-start traffic. But improvements for private car users will likely have an induced demand that increases car use. Embodied emissions are typically significant for a scheme like this, and operational maintenance, such as resurfacing, will add to its impact. It may also lead to some tree loss, but typically would mitigate this through tree planting. But at a simple level, you would expect a scheme such as this over its appraisal period to have an adverse impact, to increase carbon emissions. But looking at the profile of those emissions is, however, really important. As shown on this graph of cumulative emissions, the construction embodied impact all occurs at the beginning of the project, a time when we urgently need to be reducing our emissions. So in the case of a scheme like this, the understanding of carbon impact this provides should steer early stage decision making. If the scheme is making car use more attractive when we know that car use must fall, and if it has a significant embodied carbon impact, giving a significant net impact, is it compatible with decarbonisation commitments? Or should it be delayed until the construction process and road vehicles are decarbonised? We should also question whether additional road capacity is needed in a low carbon future where we wish to reduce car use, and therefore is this scheme robust to a different future? And this resonates with calls to move away from a predict and provide approach to transport planning, whereby traffic growth is catered for with road capacity, towards a decide and provide approach, one where we design a transport network for the changes we want to see happen, in which cases many schemes like this won't be needed. Should a road scheme such as this proceed, however, we do have a duty to understand its impact from the earliest stages and to take action to minimise its impact. So adopt PAS 2080 principles, build in costs early for low carbon construction methods, maximise tree planting, or build in maximum levels of provision for active and shared modes. So taking an opposing scenario could be a new cycle lane. This can be expected to support a mode shift from car to cycling that reduces road user emissions. Embodied carbon, however, particularly from a segregated cycle lane with plenty of new surfacing and concrete for new curbs, will erode those user benefits, but tree planting may give some additional benefits. But overall, in this example, the scheme gives a carbon benefit over its appraisal period. But it has a payback period for the user emission benefits to outweigh the carbon debt from construction. So in this example, over 10 years. And this may raise into question whether it's an over-engineered solution and if a different design philosophy is needed. Can the payback period be reduced by choosing a solution that requires less new materials? For example, reallocating road space instead of widening the highway. We've appraised a large number of these kind of sustainable transport schemes over the last year, and this has actually shown that many such sustainable schemes perform poorly in whole life carbon assessments. Like this example, there may be a long payback period, or there may be a net disbenefit when embodied and perhaps traffic consequences of prioritising active and shared modes, such as the carbon impacts of rerouting or congestion, outweigh savings from mode shift. And a key takeaway from this is the recognition that quantified carbon appraisal of a scheme does not tell the full story that decision makers need. We must also explore the strategic fit. So is this scheme the one that supports what we know must be true to decarbonise transport? So the cycle scheme is a yes, but the road scheme a no. In combination benefits, we tend to appraise schemes in isolation, but the reality is that mode shift is influenced by the wider transport system. So for example, if this scheme is one part of a wider programme of cycling upgrades, the total mode shift is likely to be greater than the sum of the parts. And future scenarios. So our appraisals forecast impacts out into the future where there is significant uncertainty. So scenario testing is important, particularly to test whether schemes are compatible with the conditions of a low carbon future. If demand for cycling is much higher in the future, the introduction of this scheme could enable and support a much greater level of mode shift than under demand today. And these factors don't dismiss the value of quantified scheme-level carbon appraisal, but it's a recognition that the carbon lens that transport planning decision-making must take has to look wider than the numbers, and it's driven the evolution of our tools and approaches so we can best support decision-making. As we've alluded to, when it comes to the carbon impacts of transport investment, another key learning is that timing matters. Firstly is the urgency of change that we noted earlier. We only have a finite amount of carbon left to emit, so if we're slow to act, we'll exhaust our carbon budgets as early as this decade. The investment decisions we make should therefore be informed by an urgency to act and with awareness of what influence key trends will have on the impact of the decisions we make. We know that the fleet will decarbonise, for example, but in the 2020s, the vast majority of the fleet is powered by fossil fuels, and so is the energy grid that provides the power for electric vehicles. So avoiding a vehicle trip in the 2020s has much more value than avoiding one in the 2040s, giving better carbon savings when they're needed most. But also co-benefits. Reducing car use now will help us improve air quality and free up space in our cities so they can be better used by people instead of cars. And this makes the 2020s a real sweet spot for interventions that avoid or shift trips, and provides a compelling case for taking bold action to deliver the sustainable transport system that many of us want to see. But we must also be mindful of the construction impact we have while our manufacturing and transport that's required to build things is still carbon intensive, meaning we need to manage carbon in planning and design, and the best scheme would be one that reduces road car use with little or no construction, so road space reallocation or low traffic neighbourhoods, for example. But conversely, these trends make it quite difficult to justify road building in the 2020s. New car trips this will encourage will be most polluting, and the significant construction works involved will have the greatest carbon impact. So road building would instead be more viable in future decades when the fleet and construction are mostly decarbonised, but at that point in time our carbon budgets will allow us very little carbon to emit, so low carbon construction and offsetting will be essential. And we recognise the challenge that this poses with the need for urgent housing growth that road building has traditionally supported. But instead, spatial and transport planning must adopt a modal hierarchy that prioritises new developments that aren't car dependent, or as referenced earlier, ensure any new road links are delivered using best practice carbon management. And as we established earlier, even with government intervention in the UK to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles, there is expected to be a significant gap to a pathway aligned to carbon budgets. Speeding up the pace of change therefore means we need to reduce car use. Technology change and spatial planning play a role in this, reducing the need for us to travel, but we can't get away from the fact that travel will continue and the switching of fuels will act too slowly. So we need to shift travel onto sustainable modes. We are already seeing this as a growing priority of transport planning. In the UK, local authorities and funding opportunities are prioritising investment in active modes and public transport. Schemes aligned to the decarbonisation agenda by encouraging a mode shift. But is this enough? Our experience applying carbon zero so far suggests it isn't. That current and planned investments in sustainable modes now will only realistically offer a small contribution towards decarbonising transport. And this comes down to behaviour change. The contribution of sustainable travel infrastructure to decarbonisation relies on improving the opportunity for people to make sustainable travel choices. For example, delivering a bus priority scheme that gives people a more viable opportunity to travel by bus as opposed to car. And this will lead to a degree of mode shift that results in carbon savings from avoiding private vehicle trips. But what determines a behaviour change is more than just physical opportunity. It's also capability and motivation and numerous factors within these. And this includes the role of cost, for example, fares for buses, but also time. And typically, in most cases, car has a lower generalised cost than more sustainable modes. It's often the quickest choice and has a cost per trip that is often less than public transport. And car use is embedded in our habits. So alone, providing sustainable travel choices will not break down enough of these behavioural barriers to create the level of mode shift we need to close this gap. Hence this slide illustrating that sustainable transport investments are unlikely to be enough to close the gap, and this has been reflected in our analysis of projects and programmes. In our recent work, we've therefore been working to use carbon zero and developing new approaches to optioneer and advise on the interventions that are needed to fill the gap, acknowledging that infrastructure is a critical part of the picture, but won't be enough alone.
So what does this mean for the bigger picture? If infrastructure alone is not the solution, and spatial planning and measures that avoid the need to travel in the first place are clearly going to play a part, but inevitably we will also need to change attitudes and behaviour towards travel choices, intervening to realise the outcomes we now know to be necessary. Fundamentally, this means a reduction in the extent of journeys that are currently undertaken by car. The concept of charging people a fee to influence private modes of travel is highly political and we realise often controversial. Yet we already do this in various forms and to varying degrees of success. And we've started to use what we've learned from these previous applications to inform how successful different approaches might be and the likely scale of intervention needed to secure the shift in behaviour that is required to plug that emissions gap. Parking charges, either in the form of charging for public use or workplace parking levies, are perhaps the most commonly applied mechanism to influence demand, increasing the cost of travel by car and thus making alternative modes more attractive. Yet whilst a valuable revenue generator, practical issues around inclusivity and extent limit the scale of demand reduction that can be realised unless implemented in combination with other measures. Traditional cordon-based congestion charges, like those in Stockholm and Singapore, have been successful in encouraging mode shift, thus helping reduce transport-related CO2 emissions. However, their scale is limited, and both had the benefit of established high-quality travel alternatives in place before introduction of the charge sought to influence their uptake. The low emission zones being implemented in parts of Europe exemplify some of the challenges to overcome when seeking to implement restrictions across a wider geography. Whilst primarily geared towards improving air quality rather than reducing carbon emissions, they do provide some secondary benefits in terms of carbon reduction. They've also had to overcome many of the similar challenges to implementation that other demand management measures face, particularly around inclusivity and public perception. So what of the future? Well, some of you may have seen only last month, the Mayor of London announced his ambition to abolish all current local road user charges and replace them with a simpler citywide scheme where drivers pay per mile with different rates depending on how polluting their vehicles are, the level of congestion in an area, and the availability of other transport alternatives. Whilst the technology to implement such a scheme is still in development, this smarter way of charging users is now technically possible and could be applied across a much wider geography. It's not unreasonable to expect a similar system may ultimately be introduced on a national basis to replace falling revenues from road tax and fuel duty as the vehicle fleet electrifies. This could potentially enable a demand management approach that is more equitable, taking into account different user needs and the travel choices available. Given the potential for such a powerful lever to reduce emissions quickly and effectively, we started to consider the future impact it might have as part of our assessments. However, significant political hurdles remain to be overcome, and ambiguity over whether national or local government will ultimately pull the lever makes the development of a comprehensive net zero strategy increasingly difficult. Whilst we might not yet have all the answers, the rate of change we're currently experiencing means it's perhaps appropriate that our approach remains flexible. We recognise that carbon reduction needs to be realised within a complex political, social and economic context, which poses different challenges in different jurisdictions, where distances and the requirements for travel can vary. However, the need for transformational change is what unites us all. Whoever ultimately pulls the demand management lever, it will be those authorities who have maximised the sustainable travel choices available in their jurisdictions that will benefit from a smoother and more progressive transition. It will be the same authorities that start to realise modal shift when it's needed most in the 2020s, helping justify that next step as an opportunity rather than a constraint. And perhaps most importantly of all, it will be those same authorities that will realise people-centric, place-based outcomes that have co-benefits for air pollution, healthier lifestyles, and the creation of urban environments in which many of us aspire to live. Despite the ominous threat posed by climate change to our current way of life, our increasing ability to make more informed decisions about priorities and effective investment means there's a real prospect of a positive, brighter vision for the future. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening. I hope you found that of interest. We've got time to just take a few questions now. Apologies if we don't get a chance to go through all of them. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll endeavour to get back to any that we aren't able to respond to today in writing after the event. So the first question, and perhaps one for you to take, Tom, if that's okay. Based on the significance of embodied impacts that you set out, it sounds like building nothing would be the best option. How should we balance this against the need to act?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, if you're familiar with the PAS 2080 carbon management guidance, in there's a hierarchy, at which the top of it is building nothing. Of course, if you don't build anything, you don't have any carbon emissions from embodied and construction, maintenance, and otherwise. But that isn't always an option. If we're to give the sustainable travel choices that we know are needed to deliver net zero transport, and we talked today about the need to reduce car use, that needs those sustainable travel choices. It needs the segregated cycle lanes, the bus priority schemes, the mass transit routes. To achieve those, we need to spend a bit of embodied carbon if we're going to get the mode shift that can realise. So, it certainly doesn't mean that we can ignore embodied carbon in accounting terms. Partly it does sit in industrial emissions and will be accounted for in any industrial decarbonisation strategies. But of course, net zero is a cross-sector problem. So really, we just need to kind of be thinking about spending embodied carbon wisely. Thinking about how we choose the right schemes, how we deliver them in a lean way. And whole life carbon assessments are a really important part of that. Understanding where the impacts are, what the hotspots are, and using carbon management processes to target those and really make our schemes as lean as possible, really kind of minimizing embodied carbon and getting the maximum user savings we can get.
Great, thank you. Next question, which I can take if you like. Given the highly political nature of the challenge to decarbonise, how are you supporting engagement with politicians whose focus is often on shorter election cycles rather than longer term strategic decisions that may prove unpopular? Well, I'm glad you picked up on the fact that it is a very political arena in which we're working. I heard it said recently that many politicians are worried about the fact that the people they represent are often more concerned about how they're going to get to the end of the week than the end of the world, which perhaps reflects the horizons within which people are sort of prioritising their focus. But I think the COVID crisis has taught us all that there are a lot of opportunities to be gained from changing the way that we currently do things. Alluded in the webinar to the fact that there is likely to be a reform to the road tax system, and that could actually provide some opportunities for politicians to address current inequalities that they would like to see addressed. I think Tom mentioned as well in the webinar that we've kind of got this sweet spot at the moment where there are co-benefits from delivery. So the solutions that deliver low carbon outcomes are currently the same solutions that improve air quality or tackle social inclusion or improve quality of life. Now, that won't always be the case as the fleet starts to electrify over time, but by targeting multiple policy agendas now, we can help make a more compelling case for interventions that some of which can actually be realised within the shorter electoral cycles that you refer to. I think it's our job to make sure that we provide the evidence in a way that's accessible so that we can start to demonstrate the local implications of what clearly is a global problem. And we also need to reflect that failing to act is starting to have short-term economic and societal consequences that we need to perhaps get better at demonstrating what they are and how they will worsen over time to avoid the tendency to kind of kick the can down the road. I think you only have to look at the energy sector that has decarbonised more rapidly than the transport sector to see that those who have seized the opportunity posed by decarbonisation are now the ones that are already starting to benefit from being more competitive, more resilient and more attractive for investment. So I think there's some lessons to learn there. Okay, just coming up to hour, so I think we've probably got time for one last question. It's a short question. I don't know if it's easy to answer or not, Tom, but it's how can we afford this?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, I mean, what we've talked about today is a transformational change. It requires just to deliver the kind of electric vehicle, infrastructure, and that drop of the line that we talked about needs huge investment in EV charging. But of course, for the mode shift that we talked about, that's infrastructure schemes and demand management measures all needs kind of revenue funding to support their setup. So yeah, we are talking significant cost, and certainly in the UK, we haven't necessarily seen that scale of funding there yet. It seems to be coming, but certainly not for the scale of challenge that we're talking about. But I guess, at a project level, if I refer back to the PAS 2080 guidance, using that kind of hierarchy and that kind of informed approach to designing schemes, if you take that, cost and carbon can really go in hand. If you design schemes that reduce the quantity of materials, you get carbon savings, but you can also reduce cost. And carbon can give a real driver for delivering those kind of lean schemes. But also, it can help us drive to deliver innovative solutions that bring costs down or avoid retrofitting at later stages. And also, I think prioritising investment where it can give the greatest effect, not just in terms of carbon savings, but also in terms of connectivity, in terms of health and some of the kind of social benefits that our schemes can give. And I think, key for us, those of us delivering transport planning schemes now, I think we need to sell the case and quantify the case for some of those benefits as well, because that will make a big difference in terms of political support. But I mean, Simon also mentioned demand management earlier. That can generate revenue, so that's a source which can then go back into delivering kind of more sustainable transport infrastructure and also feeding back into the changes we need to see. But I think to close, I think, a fundamental point is that we can't really afford not to take action. We are already seeing the consequences of climate change on transport infrastructure. The worst case scenarios for climate change will see huge, and even some of the changes we're seeing now will see huge disruption to our transport networks and therefore our economies and otherwise. So we need to invest in mitigating for climate change. Otherwise, the cost that we're going to see for adaptation in the future could be much greater. So I think we can't not afford to take action.
Great, thanks, Tom. And thanks very much to you all for joining us. And for those that did ask questions, apologies if we didn't get to respond to yours directly, but we will endeavour to get back to you after today. I hope you found the session useful. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll close it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.